What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, and welcome to week 2 of my weekly CFL football pick show for the 2025 CFL season and postseason, and we continue what has been something of a trend for us over the last 3 seasons, which is kind of stumbling out of the gate to start the season. 2 seasons ago, famously, I think we went like 3-9 with the picks. Last season, I think it was 5-7 in week 1. This season, we met in the middle. We were only 4-8 on the picks in week 1, and 2 of those 4 were just straight up winners. So the betting picks really struggled in week 1 to the tune of 2-6 overall, but that's why there's so many weeks in the season. It gives us all kinds of runway to make that a distant memory, and that's what we plan on doing starting here in week 2. So 2-2 straight up, 1-3 against the spread, 1-3 on the totals. Not the way we wanted to start the season, but that's what week 2 is for. I look at it this way. There were also 4 teams in the CFL that didn't start their season the way they wanted it to, and there's all kinds of time for them to make it right as well. One spot where I was fairly happy with how I performed in week 1 was in CFL Fantasy. Brought in 104.9 points in the opening week, so obviously that's what I've got on the season. Has me ranked just inside the top 850 overall at 834. And right from the start of the season, right from the get-go here, I'm going to put my goals on tape. My pass-fail for CFL Fantasy this year is top 500 overall. That's aggressive, but that's exactly what it is. Top 500 overall is the pass-fail for me in fantasy this year. And if I have a stretch goal, let's cut that in half. Let's go top 250. That's really the stretch goal that I'm aiming at here, because I feel like if I can achieve that, that tells me that I'm in pretty rarefied air in CFL Fantasy, and I've been doing this long enough. It's time to start shooting for the moon. So top 250, that's my goal in CFL Fantasy this year, my real goal. What does that look like after week 1? Well, the team that's in literally 500th place to get into kind of a top 500 situation put up 124.1. So about 20 points off of what I did in the first week. That's pretty manageable. Top 250 was 139, 35 points. It's more aggressive, but that's the level that we want to get at. We want to aspire to greatness, and that's what it takes. So as I said, 834 overall coming out of week 1. In CFL Central, I'm about top quarter in that league. There's over 1,000 entries in the CFL Central Fantasy Football League. I'm in 261 out of 1,044. And in Christina's league, I'm in 122nd out of 322. So top third in that one, top quarter in the biggest CFL Fantasy League that there is. Feeling pretty good about things coming out of week 1. My MVP for fantasy in week 1 was Ticats receiver Kenny Lawler. Caught 6 balls for 87 yards and a touchdown, 20.7 points natural. Now, Bo Levi Mitchell, I think, did have like 34 something, but he had my 2 times captain multiplier on. So I'm going to give it to Kenny Lawler because he had the most base points without the multiplier. So that tees us up for a week 2 slate of games that sees the BC Lions travel to Winnipeg. The Bombers open up their season without their all-CFL quarterback, Zach Collaros, who will not play in this game. Bombers host the Lions. The Montreal Alouettes, fresh off a win last week, travel to Ottawa to take on the REDBLACKS. Calgary are in Toronto, Stamps at Argos, and the Saskatchewan Roughriders hit the road. They go to Hamilton to take on the Ticats. Edmonton is off this week. The story this week from a betting perspective is home dogs. 3 of the 4 home teams this week are betting underdogs coming into their games. Winnipeg, Ottawa, and Hamilton are all 3.5-point dogs at home in their matchups. Toronto favored by 1.5, but with the way they looked in week 1, super interesting that they're the favorites. The totals this week range anywhere from 46 to 51. BC Winnipeg, it's 48. Montreal Ottawa, it's 46. Calgary Toronto, it's 50. And the largest number this week is in Saskatchewan Hamilton, that's a 51. So let's start in Winnipeg, where the Bombers playing host to the BC Lions, and the Lions offense came to play in week 1 8 yards per play in their game in week 1. Not 8 yards per completion or whatever. 8 yards per play in their week 1 matchup. A methodical 25 first downs achieved by the Lions offense in 32 minutes of time of possession. So think about that. They possess the ball for 32 minutes and they generate 25 first downs in those 32 minutes. That's pretty wild numbers. Nathan Rourke stepped back into looking like the Nathan Rourke of 2022, dominating with 378 all-purpose yards and 3 pass touchdowns. 2 of those going to Berryhill, 6 catches for a $105 and 2 scores. The Bombers, of course, had the bye in week 1. What I have to feel like is a pretty unfortunate bye situation. So they are opening their season in this matchup, and they opened the season as my favorites to win the Grey Cup. That has not changed. Winnipeg is still number 1 as far as I'm concerned coming into this season. I can very easily, though, see Winnipeg stumbling out of the gate here. They don't have Collaros. They had a number of additions on the defensive side that I don't necessarily know are familiar with the defensive scheme at this point. But again, the real X factor here is not having Zach Collaros. I'm not anti-Chris Streveler, but I understand Chris Streveler's limitations as a quarterback in a heavily passing league. I'm going to take the BC Lions here. I think they go into Winnipeg. Again, I think that it's good timing for BC here to get this matchup with Winnipeg, or this first one anyway, early in the season. I like the Lions on the road in Winnipeg to get the win over the Bombers. So on the line, Winnipeg, like I said, taking plus 3.5 against the spread. I think I'm going to have BC cover that number. Yeah, it's buying the extra half point. Maybe if it was another point or 2, I might have to bite. But I think this game is probably a 2-score game. So, I mean, you got to lay 3.5 in that context. Total in the game set at 48. I think this stays under this number. Both of these defenses, I think, are pretty good. I don't necessarily see BC having the kind of repeat offensive performance that they had in week 1 necessarily. So give me a sneaky under on this point total, under 48 points in BC Winnipeg. Let's go 26-17 in favor of the Lions, who win, cover, and stay under the point total. Montreal in Ottawa is the second matchup here. Alouettes visiting the REDBLACKS, and the Owls ground game absolutely silences the critics, primarily me, with a 163-yard performance on 26 carries. Sean Thomas Erlington contributing 86 of those yards on 17 carries all on his own, while allowing just 34 yards on 10 carries on the ground against the Argos. No run game for Toronto whatsoever. For Montreal, their defense also shined in week 1. They only allowed 276 total yards. They sacked Nick Arbuckle 3 times in that game. They were +2 in the turnover ratio, and they only allowed a 39% completion percentage on second down. 39%. So it was, 2 out of every 5 was what Toronto was able to convert into first downs on second down. You have a defensive performance like that, if you're the Alouettes, you're in a great position to win. That's exactly what they did. On Ottawa's side of things, it's pretty disappointing just in general to not start a game on time. But boy, when you don't start the game on time and it's the first game of the season, that's just a little extra rough. The REDBLACKS rally, which they did in the fourth quarter, falls a little bit short. They only scored 14 points through the first 3 quarters. I think they scored 12 in the fourth quarter, but it just winds up falling a little short against Saskatchewan. Boy, the offensive line here is my big concern for the REDBLACKS. They did not look good in this game at all. Only allowed their run game to generate 30 yards on 14 carries overall. They also allowed Drew Brown to be sacked 4 times in that game. And speaking of Drew Brown, he is not going to be playing this week. Drew Brown is out. It looks like Dustin Crum is in for the REDBLACKS. And again, that kind of O-line performance spoiled what was a great game from Drew Brown. 83% completion percentage, 413 yards, 2 touchdowns, no picks from Drew Brown. That is a stat line that should win the vast majority of football games. The O-line kind of let him down. The defense kind of let him down. It's a bad timing matchup here for the Red Blacks, especially if they're not going to have their starting quarterback. I mean, Montreal all day in this one. Let's take the Alouettes on the road in Ottawa to get the win over the Red Blacks. On the line, Ottawa's taking plus 3.5 here as a home dog. Gotta lay that 3.5 on Montreal. Look, that was the case, just like with the BC Lions. Montreal was a case of a dominant team, a top-end team, looking like a top-end team in week 1. The BC Lions were a top-end team that looked like a top-end team in week 1. So, again, that's the kind of team that you want to continue backing until they give you a reason not to. And Montreal gave us no reason last week. So let's lay the minus 3.5 on the Alouettes. Total in the game here set at 46. I think I've got to stay under it. Again, but a good chunk of Ottawa's offense came in the fourth quarter when the game was kind of out of reach. They were down 17, I think, at that point. I don't know what their offense is going to look like with Crum at the center. He's not obviously the passing quarterback that Drew Brown is. He can run, but he's not the passing quarterback that you see from Drew Brown. So I'm going to stay under this point total, 46, even though I could see Montreal getting to like a sneaky 30 in this game. I thought they looked really good. I'm going to go like 30-13 here for the Alouettes. Montreal wins. Montreal covers that minus 3.5 with ease, but another sneaky under here, even though this is the smallest number of the week. Stay under that 46-point total in Montreal, Ottawa. Calgary and Toronto is up next, and for Calgary, big play Vernon Adams, the debut of VA at quarterback for the Stamps. He was hardly big play VA in that game. He only completed 68% of his passes. He threw for 284, which is nice. No touchdowns and 2 interceptions. And interceptions obviously are something that has plagued Vernon Adams for the vast majority of his career. He did add 33 yards on 3 carries, so he can definitely be dangerous on the ground. But boy, you throw for 284 yards, you got to assume that there's going to be a touchdown in there somewhere, and it just didn't happen for Vernon in week 1. The Stamps were absolutely saved by Dedrick Mills's heroic performance, 3 rushing touchdowns on the game in week 1, kind of stealing a win there for Calgary. Beyond Mills and wide receiver Clark Barnes, who went for 112 yards on 4 catches, everybody else kind of did enough to pick up the win, given the opponent that they were up against last week, which was, of course, the Ticats. And on Toronto's side of things, look, they got pumped by 3 scores last week. They did not look good. They had no run game, which we talked about earlier. They were forced to depend on Nick Arbuckle, who, threw a touchdown at the very least, but had those 2 picks, only 273 through the air, 63% of his passing. So kind of similar to Vernon Adams, although at the very least Arbuckle put one in the end zone at one point. They were just held at arm's length for the entirety of that game where Toronto, it never felt like Toronto was super competitive in that game last week, except for, maybe the very beginning of it. 3 turnovers for the Argos on the offensive side. They took 9 penalties. They only possessed the ball for 26 minutes. It's not a recipe for success. Now, I will say, this is obviously a big competition dip for the Argos, having to play Montreal last week and then going to, play Calgary this week. It's a big difference in terms of the competition. But I'm not convinced by this offense right now at all in the context of a potential shootout. And one thing that I do know about the Calgary Stampeders, they can turn games into shootouts because their defense is not particularly great all the time. So in that context where a game could turn into a shootout, I don't really trust the Argos offense right now, and I do kind of trust Calgary's. You know what? I'm going to take the upset here. I'm going to take the Stampeders on the road in Toronto to get the win over the Argos. I said it right from the top of the season. I'm unconvinced by the Argos. Not much happened in week 1 to change that opinion. Give me the Calgary Stampeders here in the upset. Calgary goes into Toronto and beats the Argos. Now, Toronto's laying that -1.5 as a marginal home favorite. I like Calgary to win, so give me the +1.5 on the Stamps. Total in this game set at 50 points. I do think this goes over, and how's this for a little early season CFL excitement? The Calgary Stampeders walk this game off. 27-26, Stamps win, Stamps cover. Give me the over on the points on a last-second field goal. Calgary goes into Toronto and walks off the Argos. And the fourth and final game this week sees the Saskatchewan Roughriders in Hamilton taking on the Ticats. The Riders were winners last week. Hamilton was on the wrong side of things, and actually 3 of the 4 matchups this week feature a team that won in week 1 against a team that lost in week 1. The only other one is, of course, Winnipeg, who was off on a bye. Now, despite taking their foot off the gas in the fourth quarter, which Saskatchewan absolutely did, they got out to that lead, they took their foot off the gas, they allowed Ottawa to get back in that game. And that's not something that you want to see happen frequently. Ideally, it won't. But despite the fact that they did take their foot off the gas in the fourth quarter, the Riders absolutely dominated at the line of scrimmage. They allowed only 2.1 yards per carry in the run game and sacked Drew Brown 4 times, as I mentioned earlier. Now, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. They did fumble the ball 4 times in that game as part of 3 turnovers. That does add to my concerns. But look, the weapons that they have on that team, Sam Emilus, Keyshawn Johnson, Trevor Harris at quarterback, the big weapons that they have on that team are pretty darn good at masking mistakes. And speaking of weapons, they might be without AJO, but they did sign Kadeem Carey. So whether Kadeem Carey gets the start this week or if they stick with TBH, Thomas Bertrand-Houdon, who had a pretty good game in AJ Ouellette's absence. So whether it's both of them or TBH gets the start or Kadeem, gets the start or whatever it is, I like their prospects of being able to run the football, especially on this Ticats team, who do lose in Calgary by way of some hyper-aggressive play calling, which happens when you're in a hole of 17 points, which is what they were. Hamilton turned the ball over 3 times on downs, so you could tell there was like that point in the game where they were just desperate and going for it because they had to try to, make up the windfall. They were 0 for 4 in defending the red zone. All 4 times that Calgary got into the red zone, it got into the end zone. And that's a problem. You need red zone. If you do not have red zone defense in this league, you might not win a game. So you can't go 0 for 4 in the red zone and expect to have any kind of success. And look, the Swiss cheese run defense, I talked about it. 31 carries, 158 yards, and 4 rushing touchdowns allowed to the Calgary Stampeders in that week 1 game by Hamilton. And look, I'm reminded of the quote, "They are who we thought they were." That's about it when it comes to Hamilton. They are the team basically that we thought they were. They got a ton of offensive weapons. They know how to use them. They got a great quarterback. But man, this defense is just not at the point where they're going to put this team in positions to win. They are not on their opponent's level this week. I expect Saskatchewan to pretty comfortably walk away with this one. Let's take the Riders on the road in Hamilton to get the win over the Ticats, which means I'm on all 4 road teams this week. On the line, Hamilton taking +3.5 here as a home dog. I don't trust their defense enough to think that they keep this game that close, so I'm going to go ahead and lay the -3.5 on Saskatchewan, which means against the spread, I'm also on all 4 road teams. Total in this game set at 51, and even though it's the biggest total of this week, I feel pretty good about taking an over in this one. Over the 51 points feels comfy. I'm looking at this like a 36-20, 36-21, something like that. I figure it gets to a mid-50, so I'm comfortable going over on the 51 points. Saski wins, Saski covers -3.5, and an over on the 51 points. There you have it, folks. Those are the picks for Week 2 in the CFL 2025. Let's go over them here with you one more time. I'm on all 4 road teams this week. I got the BC Lions beating Winnipeg 26-17 in Winnipeg, -3.5 on the Lions, under the 48-point total. I got the Montreal Alouettes beating the Ottawa REDBLACKS 30-13 in Ottawa, -3.5 on the Alouettes, and under 46 points total. I got the Calgary Stampeders in Toronto upsetting the Argos 27-26 in a walk-off, kicking away and walking away with a win, plus the 1.5 on the Calgary Stampeders and over the 50-point total. And I got the Saskatchewan Roughriders in Hamilton beating the Ticats 36-20, -3.5 on Saskatchewan and over the 51-point total. Now, we had a good opening week in CFL Fantasy. Let's see if we can make it 2 in a row. My Week 2 CFL Fantasy roster is right in front of your eyes right now. And as you can see, we are going heavy Riders pass game. We're going to stack, double stack, in fact, Trevor Harris with Sam Emilus and Keyshawn Johnson. Keyshawn had a good outing in Week 1. Sam Emilus had a very good outing in Week 1. And again, I just think this is an excellent matchup against a really susceptible Ticats defense. In the running back game, I'm actually rolling 3 running backs this week, and they're all relatively... well, 2 of them at the very least are relatively economical. Dedrick Mills, I think, is the only one that clocks in around 10,000 or maybe even a little above. I certainly don't expect him to repeat his 3-touchdown performance, but if he did, that would be wonderful. We're going to roll with Sean Thomas Erlington as my other running back. He, again, had a good game for Montreal. I think he builds on that against a REDBLACKS defense that did not look very good to me in Week 1. And we're going to re-roll Greg Bell for the Ticats. I don't love the matchup with the Riders. Obviously, their run defense is pretty darn potent, but I like Bell's upside as a receiver in a matchup like this because I imagine Saskatchewan gets out to a lead pretty quickly. I like Bell's upside as a receiver. He could catch 5-6 balls in this game, and then all of a sudden, that score is in the high double digits, maybe even pushing the 20 points. Also going to roll the Montreal Alouettes on the defensive side. Again, we're going to try to make them eat off of Dustin Crum. They're one of the most expensive defenses, but this week, I think they're worth it. There you go, folks. That is the show for Week 2 in the CFL in 2025. I hope you enjoyed it. That's it for me, Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter. I'm in my downstairs locale trying to bring back a little bit of that luck. Do we call it luck? We're trying to turn the tides here. We want to make up for last week with a really solid Week 2. I think we're going to do it. Enjoy the games in Week 2. We will see you again for week number 3.